The rain pounded furiously against the windows of the Hendersons' old house that November afternoon. But the noise coming from inside was even more deafening than any storm. Thomas Henderson, 73 years old, sat in his wooden chair, the same one he had built with his own hands 40 years ago, with his fingers interlaced over his trembling knees. Beside him, Susan, 70, held a handkerchief against her chest, as if that piece of cloth was the only thing keeping her upright, the only thing preventing her heart from completely crumbling. In front of them, their 3 children, Robert, Catherine, and Daniel, argued with voices sharp as knives. But they weren't talking to their parents. They were talking among themselves, gesturing, pointing at papers, calculating numbers, as if the elderly couple wasn't even there, as if they were part of the inventory. Old furniture that no longer served any purpose. Objects taking up space. Obstacles in the path toward something more valuable. Money. This property is worth millions, Robert, the eldest, said, waving documents in the air with the arrogance of someone who believes numbers are more important than memories. We can't let it rot here with you two. It's illogical. It's a waste. Dad, Mom, Catherine intervened with a voice that pretended to be sweet, but sounded hollow, rehearsed, fake as a plastic coin. You can't take care of this place anymore. It's too big. It's dangerous at your age. We could sell it and everyone would benefit. You could move somewhere smaller, more appropriate. Daniel, the youngest, the one who used to sit on Thomas's knees to hear stories before bed, the one who cried in Susan's arms when he had nightmares, now stared out the window. He said nothing. He didn't defend. He didn't protest. He simply existed in that space of cowardice that is worse than direct betrayal. Indifference. Thomas pressed his lips together until they turned white. Susan squeezed her eyes shut, and a single tear escaped down her wrinkled cheek. And in that heavy silence, dense as lead, both felt the same crushing weight. The weight of having dedicated an entire lifetime to building something for those who now wanted to rip it from their hands without even blinking. That house wasn't just stacked bricks and a tile roof. It was the place where they had raised those 3 ungrateful children who now looked at them like numbers on a spreadsheet. It was the garden where Susan had cultivated red roses for decades, each one planted on special dates. The birth of each child, each anniversary, each moment worth remembering. It was the small workshop in the back, where Thomas repaired broken chairs and built tables with his own calloused hands, using ancestral techniques his father had taught him with infinite patience when he was barely a boy. It was living memory. It was solidified love. It was everything they had. But the papers Robert slammed onto the table said otherwise. They said mandatory eviction. They said forced sale for everyone's good. They said sign here or the judge will do it for you anyway. And so, under the rain that wouldn't stop falling like tears from heaven, under the impatient gazes of their own children, Thomas and Susan Henderson signed their own expulsion. They signed the end of an era. They signed the death of everything they had built, or so they thought. Because sometimes, the end is just the beginning in disguise. 3 weeks later, a dirty white moving truck parked in front of the house. It was early morning, and fog still covered the garden like a shroud. Workers began removing furniture, boxes, memories of an entire lifetime. Everything was carelessly piled in the back of the truck. Robert supervised everything with crossed arms and an expression of cold efficiency. He constantly checked his watch. He rushed the workers. Faster. We have other commitments today. Catherine checked her phone without looking up, responding to messages, occasionally laughing at something on the screen. She didn't even look at her parents. Daniel simply didn't show up. He sent a text message saying he had work commitments. Commitments more important than saying goodbye to his parents. More important than basic decency. The children had decided what their parents could take. a few boxes of old clothes, a couple of faded photographs, the old AM radio Susan had inherited from her mother, and that barely worked anymore. A thin, stained mattress. Nothing more. Nothing of value. Nothing that could be sold later. When the truck finally left, more empty than full, because most of the Hendersons' belongings had been discarded without consulting them. Thomas and Susan stood at the entrance of what was no longer their home. The keys had been handed over. The doors locked. A new lock already installed. They didn't have enough money to even rent a room. They had no living relatives who could take them in. Their old friends had disappeared over the years, some dead, others moved away, others simply lost in time. Susan began to tremble, not from cold, from fear, from absolute terror of not knowing where they would sleep that night. Thomas hugged her, but he too felt that same terror stabbing into his chest like a rusty knife. It was then, in that moment of absolute desperation, when Thomas looked up and saw something at the back of the property, something that had remained forgotten in his mind for years, buried under layers of everyday life, something not even his children had remembered. "The barn," he murmured in a hoarse voice. Susan looked at him without understanding, her eyes red and swollen. "Grandpa's old barn," Thomas repeated, pointing with a trembling finger toward the back of the property, beyond the trees that marked the boundary. "It's still there. The kids never mentioned it in the legal papers. They didn't even remember it existed. The barn. That forgotten structure of dark wood and gray stone that had served for decades to store rusty tools, farm animals, and dust-covered memories. An invisible place, ignored, considered worthless. But it was theirs. It was still theirs. Susan took a deep breath. Her tired, wet eyes found a tiny spark. So small it was barely visible, but it was there. A spark of something that seemed like hope, or maybe just stubbornness. At that age, both things are the same. "Then that's where we'll stay," she said with a firm voice, firmer than she had felt in weeks. Thomas nodded. And although neither of them had any idea how they would survive, although fear was still there beating in their chests, they began walking toward the barn, toward what seemed to be the end, but which was really just the beginning. The barn smelled of abandonment, of stopped time, of promises broken decades ago. The wooden door creaked when opened, and when the sunlight finally entered the dark interior, Thomas and Susan saw the magnitude of their new reality. The roof boards were rotten, with holes so large they could see the sky through them. The floor was compacted dirt, full of holes where mice had made burrows. The stone walls, once solid and beautiful, now had cracks so deep that wind entered whistling like mocking ghosts. There was no electricity, no running water, no bathroom, no heating. There were only 4 half-ruined walls, a roof threatening to collapse, and the deafening silence of desperation. Susan covered her mouth with her hand. Tears returned, but this time she held them back. She couldn't cry, not now. If she started, she feared she could never stop. Thomas walked slowly through the interior, with careful steps to avoid stepping on something dangerous. He ran his hand over the wooden beams his own grandfather had cut and placed almost a century ago. They were dark, covered with cobwebs and dirt, but still solid, still had life. Susan touched the stone walls, feeling the rough cold under her wrinkled fingers, but she also felt something more. She felt strength, history, the hands that had placed each stone with care and purpose. "We can do this," Thomas whispered, more to convince himself than to comfort his wife. Susan looked at him. In his eyes she saw fear. She saw uncertainty, but she also saw something she recognized because she felt it herself, an absolute refusal to give up, a deep stubbornness that comes from having lived 70 years, and knowing that life hits you, but you can choose not to stay on the ground. "Yes," Susan responded with a thread of voice. "We can, and although neither of them knew exactly how, both felt something they hadn't felt in weeks. Purpose. A reason to get up the next day. A small flame of hope that refused to go out. That night they slept on blankets spread on the dirt floor. Cold penetrated through the cracks in the walls. Night sounds, owls, crickets, wind through trees, kept them awake. Thomas hugged Susan under the threadbare blankets. "I'm sorry," he whispered in the darkness. "Sorry I couldn't protect you from this." Susan took his calloused hand in hers. "It's not your fault," she responded, "and we haven't lost. Not yet." In that moment, neither of them could imagine what was coming. They couldn't see the future that was beginning to take shape in that dilapidated barn. But something inside them, something ancient and wise, knew that this darkness wasn't the end. It was just the prologue to something greater. The first days were a brutal test of endurance. They woke before dawn, when the air was still frozen and darkness covered everything like a heavy blanket. They cooked on a small gas stove Thomas had bought at a second-hand market with the last dollars they had left. They ate cold tortillas and reheated beans, sometimes just black coffee and stale bread. They washed with cold water they brought in plastic buckets from a public faucet half a block away. Thomas made 4 trips every morning, dragging the full buckets with arms that hurt more each time. Susan used that water with religious care. Every drop was precious. Nothing was wasted. To use the bathroom, they had to walk to a gas station 2 blocks away. At first, they asked for permission. Later, when they realized the employees looked at them with pity and contempt, they simply entered without saying anything. The community watched them. They always watched them. "The old folks from the barn," the neighbors whispered when they passed on the street. "Poor things. Their children must have abandoned them. What a shame to end up like that at that age." Some looked at them with pity, others with contempt, as if poverty were contagious, as if old age combined with misery were something offensive to see. But no one offered help. No one asked if they needed anything. No one extended a hand. They just watched, commented, judged, and moved on with their comfortable lives. Thomas felt humiliation like acid in his stomach every time someone looked away with disgust. Susan gritted her teeth every time she heard the whispers. But they didn't have time for self-pity. They didn't have energy for wounded pride. They had work to do. Every morning, long before the sun rose, Thomas got up from the thin mattress they shared on the floor. His bones creaked. His back protested. But he got up anyway. He started by repairing the roof boards. He carefully climbed an old ladder he had found rusting behind the barn. Each step was dangerous. The ladder wobbled. The rotten boards threatened to break under his weight. But Thomas had worked with his hands all his life. He knew the exact weight each board could support. He knew the precise angle at which to place each beam. He used techniques his father had taught him. Ancient techniques that didn't require modern tools or expensive materials. Wood joints that came together with millimetric precision, without needing nails. Natural rope bindings that became stronger with time and moisture. Susan cleaned the stone walls. She scraped mold with a wire brush until her hands bled. She removed decades of accumulated dirt, gradually revealing the hidden beauty of the original stone. Each stone had a unique texture, a slightly different color, a history. She prepared mortar by hand, mixing lime, sand, and water in proportions her grandmother had taught her when she was a girl. She filled the cracks with infinite patience. One by one, day after day, they worked from sun to sun. They ate little. They rested less. And slowly, very slowly, the barn began to breathe again. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after arriving at the barn, when Susan made a discovery. She had been cleaning the outdoor area, removing the weeds that had grown wild for years. With each plant she pulled, with each herb she cut, the land revealed more of its original form. And then, hidden under a tangle of vines and thorny bushes, Susan saw something, the circular shape of ancient stones, a raised edge, a well. "Thomas," she called with a trembling voice, "come see this." He climbed down from the ladder where he had been repairing the roof and walked toward her, wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm. Susan pointed. "Look, I think it's the old water well." Thomas knelt beside the stone edge. He ran his hand over the rough surface. His eyes opened with surprise. "I had completely forgotten about it," he murmured. "My grandfather built it, but it stopped being used when they installed water pipes about 50 years ago." Susan looked inside. It was deep and dark. She couldn't see the bottom. "Do you think it still works?" she asked with a mixture of hope and fear. Thomas found the old rusty crank that had once been used to draw water. It was completely covered in orange rust, almost fused with time. He hit it with a stone to loosen it. Then, with all his strength, he began to turn it. At first, nothing happened. The crank squeaked and protested. The internal chains were stuck, but Thomas kept turning, and turning, and turning. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, they heard a sound. The sound of water moving. The sound of something alive waking after decades of sleep. The bucket emerged, and inside it, shining under the afternoon sunlight, there was water. Clear, fresh, pure. Susan put her hand in and tasted it. It was perfect. They looked at each other, and for the first time in weeks, they smiled. Not just with their lips, with their eyes, with their souls. "It's a sign," Susan whispered. Thomas nodded, and although they didn't say it out loud, both felt that something bigger was beginning to take shape, something they couldn't yet name. Something that still lived in the realm of the invisible, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Providence, some would call it. Destiny, others would say. But for Thomas and Susan, in that moment, it was just water, and that was enough. The months passed like leaves in the wind, some days slow as molasses, others fast as lightning. The barn began to change, not in a drastic and sudden way, but gradual, organic, like a tree that grows without anyone noticing until one day you look and it's enormous. The stone walls, once cracked and black with mold, now shone with a natural finish Susan had achieved with lime, mixed with pigments extracted from the earth itself. Deep ochres, soft grays, earth tones that made the walls look as if they had been painted by nature. The roof, previously full of holes where rain and cold entered, was now covered with clay tiles Thomas had obtained from abandoned buildings being demolished. He had gone site by site, asking permission to take the old tiles that were going to be thrown away anyway. He had cleaned them one by one. He had placed them with his own hands, creating a pattern that was both symmetrical and organic. The wooden ceiling beams, some over 100 years old, had been sanded until they gleamed. Thomas had varnished them with a mixture he prepared himself, linseed oil, pine resin, and beeswax. The result was a deep, warm shine that made the wood seem alive, breathing, telling stories with each grain and each knot. But the most surprising thing was the transformation of the interior space. Thomas had built furniture with wood he found in abandoned lots, in demolished houses, in places others considered trash. Chairs with curved backs that fit perfectly to the back. Tables with surfaces so smooth they shone like crystal under the light. Shelves built directly into the stone walls, as if they had always been there, as if they were an organic part of the structure. Each piece was unique. Each piece had soul. Susan, for her part, had begun weaving tapestries using wool she bought with the few dollars left after buying food. She used natural dyes she extracted from plants, bright yellows from wild saffron, deep reds from cochineal, soft blues from indigo. The designs she wove were those her grandmother had taught her when she was barely a girl, geometric patterns that told ancient stories, symbols representing mountains, rivers, the cycle of life. They hung from the walls like works of art. And in fact, that's what they were. Little by little, without really planning it, without fully realizing it, the barn stopped being a desperate refuge. It stopped being a place where two elderly people slept on the floor. It began to become something more, something beautiful, something that breathed with its own life, something that couldn't be explained only with words like rustic or cozy. It was a place that had soul. It was an April afternoon, as the sun set painting the sky in impossible oranges and purples, when Susan had the idea that would change everything. She was preparing coffee on the small stove, pot coffee with cinnamon and brown sugar, the kind she had learned to make from her mother, when she stopped and looked around the space they had created. The stone walls gleamed with golden light from the sunset. The tapestries moved gently with the breeze entering through the window. The wooden furniture gave off that rich, deep aroma that only old, well-cared-for wood can have. The entire place had an atmosphere of peace, of tranquility, of something indefinable that made you want to breathe more slowly, sit down, and stay. "Thomas," Susan said suddenly. He looked up from the bench where he was carving a wooden frame with intricate patterns. "What is it?" Susan extended her arms, encompassing the entire space. "Look at this place. Really look at it. We've created something special here, something other people would want to see, would want to feel, would want to experience." Thomas frowned, not completely understanding. "What if this isn't just for us?" Susan continued, her voice gaining excitement. "What if we could share it? What if we turned it into an inn, a place where people come to rest, to disconnect from the world, to find peace?" Thomas set down the frame and chisel on the bench. The idea seemed impossible. They were just two elderly people without money, without contacts, without business experience, without formal education in tourism or management. "Susan," he said with a soft voice, "we don't have capital for something like that. We have no way to promote it. We wouldn't know where to start." But Susan had that look Thomas knew perfectly after 52 years of marriage. That look he had seen when she proposed to him, instead of waiting for him to do it. That look he had seen when they decided to have their third child, despite money being scarce. That look that said, "Trust me, I know it sounds crazy, but it's possible. We don't need capital," Susan said with conviction. "We've already built everything with our own hands using what others threw away. And to promote it? Well, if it's truly special, people will find it. Isn't that how it worked before, when we were young? Good things spread by word of mouth." Thomas looked around the barn. He saw all the work they had done. He saw the beauty they had created from ruins. And he saw something more. He saw potential. "We would have to make more rooms," he said slowly, his mind already working on logistics. "Divide the space, build beds, get sheets." "I can sew the sheets," Susan interrupted with growing enthusiasm, "and dye them with natural dyes. We can make each room different, unique. We would need a functional bathroom," Thomas continued. "Shower, sink. We can connect the well to the plumbing system you build," Susan said. "I've seen that you know how to do it. Your father taught you, remember?" Thomas scratched his chin. His beard had grown long and gray during the months in the barn. It made him look like a craftsman from another era, a sage of the woods. "It would be a lot of work," he said. "We're already working hard," Susan responded. "But this would be working with purpose, with direction, with hope for something better." They looked at each other for a long time, and in that silence, they made the decision without needing words. They were going to do it. They were going to transform their desperate refuge into something more. They were going to create not just a place to sleep, but an experience, a sanctuary. They were going to prove to the world, and to themselves, that it's never too late. The next 4 months were a symphony of tireless work. Thomas divided the interior space into 2 small but perfectly proportioned rooms. He used wooden walls he cut and assembled himself, leaving strategic spaces where light could enter and create interesting patterns on the walls. In each room, he built a bed with oak wood he had rescued from an old barn being demolished. The frames were solid, elegant, with subtle carvings on the headboards, patterns of leaves, vines, symbols of growth. Susan sewed sheets with natural cotton fabric she bought at the market. She dyed them herself using flowers, herbs, and roots. One room had sheets of a deep blue like the night sky. The other, sheets of a golden ochre like wheat at sunset. On each bed she placed hand-woven blankets with traditional patterns she had been taught decades ago. The windows, previously just holes in the walls, now had carved wooden frames Thomas had created with infinite patience. The glass pieces were recycled from old windows, each with unique imperfections that created beautiful light effects when the sun entered in the mornings. Thomas built a small but functional bathroom connecting the well to the plumbing system he installed using rescued pipes and repaired valves. The shower was simple, a copper pipe with small holes he had drilled himself, but it worked perfectly. The well water was so fresh and clean it needed no additional treatment. Outside, Susan planted a garden that seemed out of a fairy tale. Lavender that perfumed the air with its calming aroma. Rosemary that grew wild and abundant. Basil for cooking. Wild pink roses that climbed the stone walls. Each plant was chosen not only for its beauty, but for its aroma, for the feeling it created, for how it interacted with the other plants. Thomas built a small patio with stones he had collected from the nearby river for weeks. Each stone the perfect size, the perfect color, the perfect weight. He placed them creating an organic pattern that seemed natural but had been carefully planned. Between the stones grew bright green moss that made the patio seem 100 years old. Under the old elm, the tree that had become their symbol, their anchor, Thomas placed wooden benches he had built to be comfortable for hours. He installed hanging lights he had bought secondhand and repaired with his own hands. Oxidized metal lanterns that created a soft, warm light when night came. And when they finally finished, when they placed the last detail, when they hung the last tapestry, when they planted the last flower, both stood at the entrance of the transformed barn and simply looked in silence. It didn't seem possible. It didn't seem real. The place that months ago had been a desperate refuge, a decadent structure where they slept on the dirt floor, was now something that seemed out of a design magazine, but better, more authentic, with more soul, because it hadn't been designed to look good in photographs. It had been built with love, with memory, with the hands of 2 people who had lost everything and decided to create something beautiful from the ashes. "We need a name," Susan said with a soft voice. Thomas thought for a long moment, looking at the old elm that had been there since before he was born, that had survived storms and droughts and the relentless passage of time. "Elm Haven," he finally said, "like the tree outside, old, strong, that has survived everything, that still stands when everyone thought it would fall." Susan took his wrinkled hand in hers. Her eyes shone. "Perfect," she whispered. "It's perfect." At first, no one came. Thomas placed a small ad in the local newspaper, barely a few lines that cost them half a day's worth of food, but which they considered a necessary investment. Elm Haven, rustic luxury inn, unique experience in contact with nature, affordable rate. Susan printed 50 flyers at a stationery store using the simplest design possible, because every dollar counted. They left them in town stores, at the market, at the church entrance. But the days passed and the phone didn't ring. They waited. They worked in the garden. They perfected details. But the phone remained silent as a grave. The townspeople continued looking at them when they went out to buy tortillas or beans. They kept whispering. The old folks from the barn are still with their delusions. Poor things. They want to make an inn, as if anyone would stay at that place. They're crazy, others said with casual cruelty. At their age, they should be in a nursing home, not playing at being entrepreneurs. Thomas began to doubt. At night, while lying in the bed he himself had built, he looked at the ceiling he himself had repaired, and felt the weight of uncertainty crushing his chest. What if they had wasted months of work on a fantasy? What if no one ever came? What if they died in this barn without anyone knowing or caring? But Susan, who had always been the most stubborn of the two, refused to give up. "Someone will come," she said every night before sleeping, like a mantra, like a prayer. "Someone who needs what we've created here. We just have to wait. We just have to have faith." And she was right. The first guest arrived on a Thursday afternoon, when the sun began to descend and painted the sky in impossible colors. Her name was Laura Martinez. She was a woman of about 40 with dark circles deep as craters, hands that trembled slightly, and a small suitcase that seemed to contain her entire life. She arrived without warning, without reservation, after having seen the yellowed and wrinkled ad in a grocery store. "I need a quiet place," she said with a broken voice when Susan opened the door. "Away from everything. Do you have space?" Susan saw something in that woman's eyes. She saw pain. She saw exhaustion. She saw someone who was on the edge of something terrible. And she recognized that look because she herself had had it months ago. "Yes," Susan said with a warm smile that came from her soul. "We have space. Come in, please." She received her with a cup of herbal tea she had grown in the garden. Chamomile, lavender, a touch of mint. Thomas showed her the room, the polished wooden bed, the sheets that smelled of lavender and sun, the window overlooking the garden where roses were beginning to bloom, the tapestry on the wall that told stories without words. Laura didn't say much that first night. She barely tasted the dinner Susan prepared. Vegetable soup with fresh herbs from the garden, artisan bread she had learned to make. She went to her room early and closed the door. But when she came out to the patio the next morning, Thomas saw her sitting on one of the benches under the elm, eyes closed, face toward the sun, breathing deeply for the first time in months, maybe in years. She stayed 3 days. She didn't talk much, but she walked through the garden. She sat under the elm for hours. She helped Susan weave. She watched Thomas carve wood, and little by little, something in her face began to change. The tension lines softened. Her eyes lost that frantic shine of desperation. On the third day, when she was packing her suitcase to leave, Laura hugged Susan and began to cry. "You don't know what you've done for me," she said between sobs. "I came here thinking about dark things, terrible things, but this place, you, gave me a reason to keep trying." Susan hugged her tighter. Thomas put a hand on her shoulder. "This place found you because you needed it," Susan said with a soft voice. "Nothing is coincidence." When Laura left, she left an envelope with money, more than they had asked for, and a note that said, "Thank you for saving me." But what changed everything was what she did after. She wrote a review online, on a travel website, with photographs she had taken of the garden, the barn, the tapestries, the sunset light filtering through the windows. The review said, "It's not a hotel, it's a home, a place where time stops and you can breathe again." The hosts, Thomas and Susan, are two beautiful souls who have created absolute magic with their own hands. If you need to heal, if you need to remember what it feels like to be at peace, go here. This place will change you. After Laura, others began to arrive. A writer named Michael, who needed absolute silence to finish his novel. He stayed 2 weeks, writing during the day on the patio under the elm, sharing wine with Thomas at night while they talked about life, art, the meaning of things. A young couple, Carmen and James, who had lost their baby 6 months ago and needed a place where they could cry without anyone judging them, where they could simply exist in their pain without having to pretend they were okay. Susan hugged them when they cried. Thomas taught them to work wood, to create with their hands, to transform pain into something tangible and beautiful. An older man named Bernard, who had been fired from his job after 30 years and had lost his sense of purpose. Thomas showed him that a person's value isn't in their title or salary, but in their capacity to create, to love, to get up each day and do something meaningful. A young woman named Sophia, who had escaped an abusive relationship and needed to remember she was strong, she was valuable, she deserved to take up space in the world. Susan taught her to weave, and with each thread she intertwined, Sophia also intertwined her broken spirit. Each guest found something different at Elm Haven, but everyone found the same thing: peace, acceptance, a connection with something deeper than themselves. Susan received them with tea and genuine conversation. Not the superficial, polite conversation of hotels. Real conversation. She asked about their lives. She truly listened. She made them feel seen. Thomas showed them his improvised workshop where he carved wood. He taught them ancient techniques. And while they worked together, his rough hands guiding the guests' hands, he shared wisdom he had accumulated in 73 years of life, not with sermons, just with simple observations that stayed engraved in the soul. And little by little, online reviews began to multiply. This place saved me. The Hendersons aren't just hosts, they're healers. The most beautiful and authentic barn I've seen in my life. I came broken and left whole. It's not tourism, it's therapy for the soul. Each review brought more people, and each person left transformed. Elm Haven became something more than an inn. It became a sanctuary, a place of pilgrimage for wounded souls, a beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. And then, something unexpected happened. One September morning, Susan opened the old phone Thomas had repaired, a second-hand device that barely worked but allowed them to communicate with guests, and saw something she didn't understand. Hundreds of notifications, thousands, messages, comments, reservation requests. The phone vibrated non-stop. "Thomas," she called with a trembling voice, "come see this." He left the table he was varnishing and approached, wiping his hands on the varnish-stained apron. "What's happening?" Susan showed him the screen. There was a post on social media from an account with millions of followers showing photographs of Elm Haven. The author was a travel influencer named Andrea Solis. She had visited the Haven the previous week, posing as a normal tourist. She hadn't said who she was. She hadn't mentioned she had a massive audience. But now she had posted a complete thread of photographs and text. I thought I had seen everything in my years of traveling the world. Luxury hotels in Bali, exclusive resorts in the Maldives, castles in Europe. But nothing has impacted me like this place. Elm Haven isn't a hotel. It's a living work of art created by two elderly people who were stripped of everything by their own children. Thomas and Susan Henderson lost their home, their money, their dignity. They were left with nothing more than an abandoned barn. And with that nothing, they built this. The photographs showed the transformed barn, the stone walls gleaming with golden light, Susan's tapestries hanging like masterpieces, Thomas's hand-carved furniture, the garden blooming in explosions of color, the sunset light filtering through the windows creating magical patterns. But the photograph that became most shared was a simple one. Thomas and Susan holding hands under the elm, looking at the garden they had created together. Two elderly people with deep wrinkles and calloused hands, but smiling, radiant, victorious. The text continued. Everything you see here was built with their own hands, every piece of furniture. Thomas is 73 years old and climbs ladders to repair roofs. Susan is 70 and weaves each tapestry fiber by fiber. They use ancestral techniques they learned from their parents and grandparents. They have no helpers, no investors, no education in design or business. They only have love, dedication, and an absolute refusal to give up. This is what resilience means. This is what creating beauty from pain means. This is what aging with dignity and purpose means. If you ever thought it was too late to start over, look at this. If you ever felt you had lost everything, look at this. If you ever doubted your ability to create something beautiful, look at this. Thomas and Susan taught me more in 3 days than all the self-help books I've read in my life. This is the most special place in America, maybe in the world. The post went viral in hours. Thousands of shares, tens of thousands of comments, millions of views. Local media began calling, then national media, travel magazines, television programs, design blogs. Everyone wanted to tell the Henderson story. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Email filled with reservation requests. People offering help, investment, expansion. Susan sat in a chair, overwhelmed. Thomas put his hands on her shoulders. "What do we do?" she asked with a small voice. Thomas looked around the haven they had built. Then he looked at his wife of 52 years. "We keep being ourselves," he said with a firm voice. "We don't change anything. We don't expand. We don't accept investors. We keep this small, authentic, real. Because that's what makes this place special. Not the design, but the love with which it was made." Susan nodded, and although the world now knew them, although fame had arrived unexpectedly and unstoppably, both knew they couldn't lose the essence of what they had created. Elm Haven would remain what it always was, a home, a sanctuary, a testament that it's never too late. But with fame came something else, something dark that both had known would eventually arrive. One October afternoon, while Thomas was repairing a chair on the patio and Susan was watering the garden, they heard the unmistakable sound of a luxury car parking at the entrance. Thomas's heart stopped. Susan dropped the watering can. Robert got out of the car first. Expensive suit, shiny shoes, false smile. Catherine followed him, dressed with unnecessary elegance, carrying a purse that probably cost more than Thomas and Susan had earned all year. And finally Daniel, who couldn't look his parents in the eyes. "Dad," Robert said, approaching with outstretched arms as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't stripped them of everything barely a year ago. "How have you been? We've seen what you've done here in the news, on social media. It's incredible. We're so proud." The words were sweet, but they were rotten inside. Thomas didn't move. His hands closed into fists. Not of violence, of restraint. Susan came out drying her hands on her apron. Her face was an impassive mask. But inside, her heart beat like a war drum. Catherine tried to hug her. "Mom, we've missed this so much. We've missed family. And when we saw what you achieved here, we knew we had to come. We always knew you had talent. We always believed in you." The lie was so obvious, so grotesque, it was almost comical. Susan took a step back, avoiding the embrace. Daniel finally spoke, with a barely audible voice. "I'm sorry. For everything." They were the first honest words, but they came too late. Years too late. "What do you want?" Thomas asked with a calm voice, but with a steel edge underneath. Robert cleared his throat. He took out some papers from his elegant leather briefcase. "Well, we've been thinking. This place has incredible potential. You could expand, make 10 more rooms, hire professional staff, a chef, a manager. You could turn this into an empire, and we could help. You know, with modern management, digital marketing, finances, contacts, we want to be partners." Catherine interrupted with that smile that pretended to be sweet, but was pure poison. "A fair division. You provide the place and concept. We provide business knowledge. Everyone wins. The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to have physical weight. Susan looked at her 3 children for a long time. She really looked at them, and she saw clearly what had always been there. But she had refused to see selfishness, greed, the absolute lack of real empathy. Then she looked at Thomas, and in that silent exchange, the kind of communication only 50 years of marriage can create, both knew exactly what to do. No, Susan said with a soft but unbreakable voice like ancient rock. Robert blinked, confused. What? No, Thomas repeated, slowly rising from his chair. We don't need partners. We don't need your help. We don't need anything from you. But Dad, Robert insisted with a condescending tone that barely hid frustration, you don't understand how modern business works. This could be huge, but without professional management, it could collapse. You could lose all of this through mismanagement. Thomas walked toward his eldest son. He planted himself in front of him, and although Robert was taller, younger, physically stronger, it was he who stepped back before his father's presence. We already lost everything once, Thomas said with a voice that trembled not from fear but from contained emotion. When you took it from us, when you stripped us of our home, of our dignity, of everything we had built in 60 years of life, you left us on the street like trash, like disposable objects that no longer served a purpose, obstacles in your way. The 3 children fell into uncomfortable silence. And you know what we discovered after that? Thomas continued. We discovered that everything that really matters can't be taken by anyone, can't be sold, can't be stolen, can't be lost. It's here, he said, hitting his chest with his fist. And here, he added, taking Susan's hand and intertwining his fingers with hers. Susan stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband. We built this place with our own hands, she said, with a voice that no longer trembled, a voice full of strength coming from the depths. Every stone we cleaned, every board we repaired, every flower we planted, every tapestry we wove. We did it without your help, without your money, without your permission, without your approval, and we did it because we believed in ourselves when no one else did, especially when you didn't. Catherine tried to interrupt, her voice rising an octave with false emotion. Mom, you left us to live in a barn. Susan cut her off. Her voice no longer trembled at all. It was firm as steel forged in fire. You treated us like obstacles, like problems that needed to be eliminated, like things you could discard without thinking twice. And now that you see we've created something beautiful, something valuable, something that's in all the news and social media, now you want to be part of this. Now we're family to you. But you can't have it. You can't have a single stone of this place, because every inch here was built with tears and blood and work you'll never understand. Daniel finally spoke, with tears running down his cheeks. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I abandoned you when you needed me most. It was sincere. Thomas could see it. Susan could feel it. But the damage was already done. Some wounds heal. Others leave permanent scars. Thomas approached his youngest son. For a moment it seemed he was going to hug him, but instead he simply put a hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry too, son, he said with a voice laden with ancient sadness. Sorry I didn't teach you the true value of loyalty, the true meaning of family, the value of honest work and unconditional love. That's my failure as a father, and I'll have to carry that until the day I die. The words fell like stones in still water, creating waves that expanded and expanded. Robert, with a face red with anger and poorly disguised indignation, pointed an accusing finger. You're going to regret this. Without professional help, without modern management, this place will fall apart. In a year you'll be broke and begging for help. And when that happens, don't come crying to us. Thomas smiled. A sad but infinitely wise smile. A smile only 73 years of life can create. "Maybe you're right," he said with absolute calm. "Maybe this place will fail. Maybe we'll lose everything again. But if that happens, it will be our failure, not yours, and we'll learn from it. As we've learned from every fall, every blow, every betrayal. Because that's what people who don't give up do. We get up, again and again, until we can't anymore. And even then, we try one more time." Susan took Thomas's hand, intertwining her wrinkled fingers with his. "Now, if you'll excuse us," she said with a dignity that seemed to fill the entire space. "We have guests waiting for dinner. People who came here looking for peace. People who trust us. And we're not going to disappoint them by standing here wasting time with this conversation." And without saying another word, without looking back, both turned and walked toward the barn. The three children stood in the patio, like pillars of salt. They wanted to say something. They wanted to shout. They wanted to force the conversation. But there was nothing to say. Words had been exhausted. Opportunities had been wasted. Finally, Robert made a sound of disgust, put the papers in his briefcase, and walked toward the car. Catherine followed him, still checking her phone as if nothing had happened, as if this were just a minor inconvenience in her day. Daniel stayed a moment longer, looking at the barn, looking at his parents walking away. He wanted to run after them. He wanted to throw himself on his knees and truly ask for forgiveness. But he didn't, and that moment of cowardice would haunt him for the rest of his life. They got in the car, started it, left, and they never returned. The following months were a whirlwind of activity, attention, and continuous transformation. Elm Haven appeared in travel magazines from around the world. Architectural Digest did a special article. National Geographic Traveler named it one of the most authentic destinations in North America. People from Canada, different states, even some Europeans and Latin Americans began making reservations 6, 8, even 10 months in advance. Some came for the beauty of the place, for the photographs they had seen on social media, for the rustic but elegant design, for the gardens that seemed taken from a dream. Others came for the story, to meet Thomas and Susan, to hear directly from their lips how they had transformed abandonment into beauty, betrayal into triumph. But everyone, absolutely everyone, left transformed. Because Elm Haven wasn't just a place to sleep. It wasn't just a photogenic destination for Instagram. It was a place that changed you inside. It was a place that forced you to slow down, to breathe, to reconnect with the essential. Thomas continued giving carpentry workshops every Saturday. He taught guests how to work wood with ancestral techniques, how to create with patience, how to find beauty in knots and imperfections, how each piece of wood has its own story and personality. "Wood teaches you humility," he would say, while his calloused hands guided the inexperienced hands of guests. "You can't force it. You can't rush it. You have to listen to it, respect its grain, work with it, not against it, like life itself." Susan gave weaving and gardening classes on Sundays. She taught how to cultivate herbs, to create natural dyes from flowers and roots, to weave traditional patterns that told stories without words. "Each thread is a choice," she would say, while her agile fingers moved the wool with a speed that defied her age. "Each color is an emotion. Each pattern is a story. When you weave, you don't just create fabric. You create a piece of your soul made visible." And every night, without fail, after guests retired to their rooms, Thomas and Susan sat under the old elm. Sometimes they talked about the guests who had arrived that day. Sometimes they planned improvements for the haven. But most of the time, they simply held hands in silence, looking at the stars that shone in the dark sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. "Did you ever imagine this?" Susan would ask on those quiet nights. Thomas always answered the same. "Not in this way. But I always knew we'd be okay, because I have you." And Susan would rest her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body despite the years, feeling the strength that still existed in that man who had built all this with his own hands. "And I have you," she would whisper. "Always you." A year and a half after the opening of Elm Haven, Thomas and Susan received an official letter from the government. They had been nominated for the National Sustainable Tourism Award, a distinction given to projects that combined tourism excellence with cultural authenticity, respect for the environment, and positive social impact. Susan read the letter 3 times, unable to believe it. Thomas scratched his beard, now completely white, and smiled with a mixture of pride and shyness. "Are we going?" Susan asked. "We have to go," Thomas responded. "Not for us, but for everyone who thinks it's too late. For everyone who believes that after 70, there's only waiting for death. We have to show them they're wrong." The ceremony took place in Washington, D.C., in an elegant hall full of tourism entrepreneurs, government officials, and journalists. Thomas and Susan arrived wearing their best clothes, which remained simple and modest, but clean and dignified. They felt out of place among so much luxury and sophistication. But when the time came to announce the winners in their category, when they heard Thomas and Susan Henderson, Elm Haven, something changed in them. They went up on stage holding hands, and when the entire audience, hundreds of people, stood to applaud them, when they saw it wasn't polite and obligatory applause, but applause that came from the soul, expressing genuine admiration and deep respect, both felt their eyes fill with tears. They weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of validation, of recognition, of having reached the other side of darkness and found light. They handed the award to Thomas, a crystal plaque engraved with their names and the Havens logo. But he immediately passed it to Susan. "Without you," he whispered in her ear, "none of this would exist." When they were asked to give an acceptance speech, Thomas approached the microphone. His voice trembled slightly. He wasn't used to speaking in public, but the words came out clear and true. "When they took everything from us, our home, our savings, our dignity, we thought it was the end. We thought at our age, without resources, without support, with nothing except our hands and our love for each other, there was no future. There was only waiting, waiting to die." He paused. The room was in absolute silence. Even the sound of collective breathing seemed to have stopped. "But we were wrong," he continued. "It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because when you have nothing, when absolutely everything has been taken from you, the only thing you have left is what you really are. And that essence, no one can take from you." Susan joined him at the microphone, her voice adding strength to her husband's. "We built Elm Haven with our hands," she said with a clear, firm voice. "But we built it with our hearts, with our memories, with the techniques our parents and grandparents taught us, with the love of 52 years of marriage. And that's the difference between a business and a home, between a hotel and a sanctuary." Thomas continued, "This award isn't just for us. It's for everyone who thinks it's too late. For everyone who feels they have nothing more to offer the world. For everyone who was betrayed by those they trusted. This award says, yes, you can. Yes, you have value. Yes, your life still has purpose. Never, never is it too late." The applause that followed was deafening, but more than the sound, it was the visible emotion on the audience's faces that Thomas and Susan would remember forever. People openly crying, people standing, people who had come expecting a formal and boring ceremony, but who instead received a reminder of why they had chosen to work in tourism in the first place. Not for the money, but for the possibility of creating experiences that transformed lives. Today, 3 years after that rainy afternoon when Thomas and Susan signed their own eviction, Elm Haven continues receiving guests from around the world. Reservations are full a year in advance. People from over 40 different countries have slept in the beds Thomas built with his hands, have eaten at the tables he carved with infinite patience, have walked barefoot through the garden Susan planted with love. But Thomas and Susan refused to expand. They rejected dozens of offers from investors who wanted to turn the Haven into a chain, a franchise, an empire. They rejected interviews on television programs that wanted to turn their story into a reality show. What we have here is special because it's small, Susan explained every time someone suggested expanding. Because we can know each guest by name. Because we can sit down for breakfast with them and hear their stories. If we grow, we lose that. And that's the only thing that really matters. Thomas, now 76, continues building furniture. His hands are slower, his movements more careful. His knees protest when he climbs stairs. His back aches in the mornings. But he keeps working, because work gives him purpose, gives him reason to get up each day. Susan, 73, continues weaving tapestries that now sell in art galleries in New York City. She continues cultivating the garden that has become a spectacle of colors and aromas that changes with each season. Her vision isn't what it was. Her fingers move more slowly, but they keep creating beauty. And every night, without fail, both sit under the old elm. Some nights they talk. Others they simply exist in silent company. But always, always they give thanks. For the barn that became a haven. For the hands that created beauty from abandonment. For the love that resisted the deepest betrayal. For the guests who arrive broken and leave healed. For the second chances life offers when you least expect them. And for the most important lesson they learned, that a person's value isn't in what they possess, but in what they can create, in how they can rise after each fall, in how they can choose love over resentment, construction over destruction, hope over despair. 5 years after that afternoon when Robert, Catherine, and Daniel left in their luxury car, leaving their parents standing under the elm, something changed. Daniel, the youngest son, the one who had asked for forgiveness too late, appeared one morning at the entrance of the Haven. But he didn't arrive in an elegant car. He arrived walking, and he didn't come alone. He brought his 2 children, an 8-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. "Dad, Mom," he said with a broken voice, "I know I have no right to be here. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But Manabonat, my children need to meet you. They need to know their grandparents. They need to learn what you can teach them about work, about love, about never giving up." Thomas and Susan looked at each other. In that silent exchange, they made a decision. Resentment is a poison that poisons the one who takes it. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's not pretending the damage never happened. It's choosing not to allow that damage to define your future. "Come in," Susan said simply. And so began the healing. Daniel didn't stay at the Haven. He didn't ask to be part of the business. He didn't ask for money or recognition. He simply came every Sunday with his children. And Thomas taught them to work wood. And Susan taught them to weave. And the children learned what their own parents had never taught them. That true value is in creating, not in possessing. Robert and Catherine never returned. And that's okay. Some wounds are too deep to heal. Some relationships are broken beyond repair. And that's also part of life. But Daniel found his way back. And that was enough. If you've listened to this story until the end, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for accompanying Thomas and Susan on this journey from darkness to light. Thank you for believing, even if just for these minutes, that second chances exist. That age is just a number. That never, never is it too late to start over. Because Thomas and Susan's story isn't just their story. It's all of our stories. We all face moments where it seems we've lost everything, where people we trusted betray us, where the future seems closed and dark. where age or circumstances make us believe we have nothing more to offer. But the truth is this: as long as we have hands to create, heart to love, and will to get up, there's always an opportunity to build something beautiful. Thomas was 73 when he started rebuilding that barn. 73. An age when society says you should retire. Rest. Let others do the work. Wait for the end. But he chose to create. He chose to build. He chose to prove that life doesn't end at 70, or at 80, or at 90. Life ends when you stop trying, when you stop believing, when you accept you have nothing more to offer. It doesn't matter how old you are right now. It doesn't matter how many times you've fallen. It doesn't matter who abandoned or betrayed you. What matters is that you keep believing, that you keep creating, that you keep loving, that you keep trying. Because life, like Thomas and Susan's old barn, can always be transformed. It just needs hands willing to work and a heart that refuses to give up. Thomas and Susan lost their home, lost their money, lost their children's loyalty, but they gained something much more valuable. They gained absolute proof that they're capable of creating beauty, even in the darkest circumstances. They gained the certainty that their love can withstand any storm. They gained the peace that comes from knowing they lived with dignity, with purpose, with integrity until the end. And that's true success. Not money in the bank, not public recognition, not awards or 5-star reviews. True success is being able to look at yourself in the mirror and be proud of who you are, of how you lived, of how you loved, of how you got up every time you fell. Thomas and Susan have that success, and you can have it too. It doesn't matter where you are today. It doesn't matter how dark the path seems. There's always light on the other side. There's always hope. There's always an opportunity to start again. You just have to take the first step, and then the next, and then the next. Like Thomas repairing one roof board at a time. Like Susan cleaning one stone of the wall at a time. Step by step, day by day, with faith, with love, with unbreakable determination. And one day, you'll look back and see that you transformed your own abandoned barn into a beautiful haven. One day, you'll be the one who inspires others not to give up. One day, your story will be the one someone needs to hear to find the strength to get up one more time. That day can start today, right now. It only depends on you. Leave me your comment below. Have you ever had to start from zero? What did that experience teach you? Is there an abandoned barn in your life that you're ready to transform? Share your story. You never know who you might inspire today. Your comment could be exactly what someone needs to read right now. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that it's never too late to start over, share it. Because somewhere there's someone who's about to give up, someone who thinks they have nothing more to offer, someone who needs to hear there's still hope. Your sharing could save a life, could change a destiny, could be the spark that ignites a transformation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening until the end. Thank you for believing in second chances. And remember, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Your barn is waiting. Your hands are ready. Your story is about to begin. Until the next story. And may it be as beautiful as the one you just heard. With all my heart, thank you.